Lightning cracked the sky wide open, and in that white-hot instant, Cornelius Yates saw the wall of water surging down the canyon behind them like a living thing sent to devour them both. Left. 3 steps, now stop. Irene Wallace's voice cut through the roar of the storm, steady as a rifle barrel, and Cornelius obeyed without question, though every instinct in his body screamed that a blind woman could not possibly know what waited in the black throat of that canyon better than a man with 2 good eyes. He stopped, his boot hovered over nothing. Below him, where the lightning had shown solid ground only a heartbeat before, there was now a drop of 20 feet into churning brown water and jagged stone. "How did you—" His voice broke off as the ground trembled beneath the coming flood. "There is no time for how, Mr. Yates," Irene shouted over the wind, her fingers finding his forearm and pulling him hard to the right, guiding him along a ledge no wider than a supper plate. "There is only trust or drowning. Choose quickly." Behind them, torches bobbed in the rain like hungry eyes, and the voice of Sela's Marsh's foreman echoed off the rock walls, promising death to the man who had seen too much, and the woman fool enough to help him. Cornelius pressed his back to the cliff, felt the seamstress's small, sure hand tighten on his sleeve, and for the first time in his hard, wandering life, he let someone else decide whether he lived or died. She did not hesitate. She never hesitated. And that was the moment Cornelius Yates understood that everything the town of Redemption Gulch had ever whispered about Irene Wallace being helpless, being fragile, being a burden dressed in calico, had been a lie so complete it bordered on cruelty. But to understand how a wounded drifter and a blind seamstress came to be running for their lives through a flash flood in the New Mexico territory in the autumn of 1879, one must go back 3 weeks, to the dusty afternoon when Cornelius Yates first stumbled, bleeding and hunted, through the door of her little shop on Cottonwood Street. Redemption Gulch was not much of a town in those days, a scattering of clapboard buildings clinging to the edge of a canyon country that seemed to stretch on forever, red rock and dry wind, and the constant threat of drought. It had one saloon, one church, one general store, and one dressmaker's shop with a hand-painted sign that read WALLACE Fine Tailoring and Mending, beneath which, in smaller letters someone had once scratched out and never bothered to fix, it still faintly read Blind, as though her condition were a defect to be advertised rather than a fact of her life she had long since made peace with. Irene Wallace had lost her sight at the age of 12. When a fever swept through the wagon train her family had been traveling with on the way west from Missouri. The fever had taken her mother entirely and taken Irene's eyes, though it had left her mind sharper than a Bowie knife, and her hands more skilled than any seamstress for 200 miles. Her father, Amos Wallace, a trail guide and trapper who had spent 20 years reading the canyons and mesas of the territory by sight, sound, and smell, had refused to let his daughter's blindness become a cage. He had walked every trail with her 100 times, describing the turns, the echoes, the way the wind changed pitch when it funneled through a narrow pass, the particular hollow sound of dry wash sand under boot compared to solid rock. He had taught her to shoot by the sound of a cocking hammer and the whisper of wind past a target, and he had taught her, above all, that the canyon was not her enemy but her oldest friend, one who spoke to her in a language most sighted men had never bothered to learn. Amos Wallace had died 2 years before Cornelius Yates ever rode into town, thrown from his horse during a rockslide he had not seen coming, in a cruel irony that haunted Irene more than she would ever admit aloud. Since then, she had run her father's small parcel of canyon land and her dressmaking shop alone, refusing every offer of charity, every suggestion that she sell the land and move somewhere safer, somewhere a blind woman might be properly cared for. The town had watched her with a strange mixture of pity and suspicion, the women whispering that it was unnatural for a blind girl to live alone, the men muttering that she would starve or burn the shop down before the year was through. And yet, year after year, Irene Wallace's stitches remained the finest in 3 counties, her seams straighter than any sighted seamstress could manage, her measurements taken by careful hands that read a body's shape the way other women read a letter. She had grown used to doubt. She had grown used to customers who spoke slowly and loudly around her, as though blindness had also stolen her hearing and her wits. She had grown used to children daring one another to knock on her door and run, and to the particular cruelty of Silas Marsh, the richest and most feared man in Redemption Gulch, who had proposed marriage to her the previous spring not out of affection, but out of naked greed for the canyon land her father had left her. Land that everyone in town suspected, though none could prove, held a vein of silver worth more than the whole territory combined. Irene had refused him. She had refused him plainly, without flinching, standing in her own doorway with her chin lifted and her sightless eyes fixed somewhere over his left shoulder. And she had told him that she would rather run her land into the ground with her own 2 hands than hand it to a man who saw her only as a means to an end. Silas Marsh had smiled thinly, tipped his hat, and told her that blind women who lived alone on valuable land sometimes came to unfortunate ends, and that he hoped, for her sake, that would not happen to her. She had not forgotten that smile. She thought of it often, in the quiet hours of the night when the wind moaned through the canyon behind her small house, and she lay awake listening to every sound as though it might be the one that finally proved him right. It was into this uneasy peace that Cornelius Yates arrived, 3 weeks before the storm that would change both their lives forever. He came into town on a lathered, half-lame horse just after noon, slumped low in the saddle, his shirt soaked through with sweat and blood from a bullet wound that had grazed his ribs 2 days before. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with the sun-darkened skin of someone who had spent years working cattle under an unforgiving sky, and a face that might have been handsome if it were not so tightly drawn with pain and something darker than pain, something that looked very much like fear. He did not go to the doctor first, because the doctor's office sat directly across from the sheriff's, and Cornelius Yates had very good reasons to avoid anyone wearing a badge. Instead, half delirious from blood loss and heat, he saw the small sign for WALLACE fine, tailoring and mending, and some instinct, perhaps the last clear thought his exhausted mind could manage, told him that a dressmaker's shop was the least likely place anyone would think to look for a wanted man. He fell more than walked through her door, and the bell above it rang out with a startling cheerfulness at odds with the sight of him collapsing against her work table, scattering pins and spools of thread across the floor. Irene Wallace did not scream. She did not call for help. She rose from her chair with the calm efficiency of a woman who had faced far worse than a bleeding stranger, and her hands found him immediately, moving over his shoulders, his arms, his side, until they found the source of the wet warmth soaking through his shirt. "You are bleeding," she said, her voice remarkably even. "I noticed," Cornelius managed, gritting his teeth against the pain, and despite everything, despite the fever creeping through his blood and the men he knew were surely still tracking him, he found himself almost smiling at the dryness in her tone. "Sit," she instructed, guiding him with surprising strength into the chair beside her work table. "And do not bleed on the blue silk. It belongs to Mrs. Hutchins, and she will notice." He obeyed, mostly because he had no strength left to do otherwise, and watched with growing astonishment as this small woman, her pale eyes fixed and unmoving, worked with quick, sure fingers to strip away his shirt and examine the wound beneath. She did not fumble. She did not hesitate. Her fingertips traced the edges of the gash with the same careful precision she might use to measure a hem, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had done this before. "This needs cleaning and stitching, not just bandaging," she said. "You are fortunate the bullet only grazed you, Mr. Yates," he said. "Cornelius Yates." "Mr. Yates," she repeated, and something in the way she said his full name without the drawling shortening most folks used made him feel oddly seen, despite the fact that she could not see him at all. "I am going to clean this now. It will hurt considerably more than it already does." I've had worse." "I do not doubt it," she said, reaching for a bottle of carbolic acid solution on her shelf, her hand finding it unerringly among a dozen similar bottles. Men who arrive bleeding through the back door of a seamstress's shop rather than the front door of a doctor's office usually have quite a story behind them. He hissed as the solution hit the wound, but his mind was already turning over her words, weighing how much to tell her, how much a blind woman in a small town could possibly do with the truth even if he gave it to her. "Maybe I just don't like doctors," he said finally. "Maybe," Irene agreed, threading a needle with a speed and precision that made him stare, despite the pain, despite the danger, despite everything. Her fingers moved without hesitation, guided by touch and long practice, and within a few minutes she had closed the wound with neat, even stitches that would have done credit to any surgeon in Santa Fe. "Or maybe you are running from someone, Mr. Yates, and you calculated correctly that no one would think to search a blind seamstress's shop for a wounded fugitive." He went very still. "Now why would you say a thing like that?" "Because your horse is standing in front of my shop wearing a Bar M brand crossed out with a running iron, badly done, I might add, and because you flinched at the church bell a moment ago as though it were a gunshot, and because you have been listening to the street outside more than you have been listening to me." She tied off the last stitch and sat back, her sightless eyes somehow finding his face with unnerving accuracy. "I may be blind, Mr. Yates, but I am not stupid, and I would ask that you not treat me as though I were both." For a long moment, Cornelius Yates said nothing at all. He simply looked at her, at the steady set of her jaw, the quiet confidence in her hand still resting near his ribs, and felt something shift inside his chest that had nothing to do with the wound she had just closed. He had spent the better part of 10 years reading people, a skill that had kept him alive through a war he had not wanted to fight and years of hard, lonely work across half a dozen territories, and he prided himself on being difficult to fool. And yet this woman who could not see his face at all had read him more accurately in 5 minutes than most men managed in a year. "You're right," he admitted quietly, "about all of it." "I usually am," Irene said, without a trace of arrogance, only simple fact, and began wrapping clean linen bandages around his ribs with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything else. He told her more that afternoon than he had told any living soul in the 2 years since the war had ended, though he did not tell her all of it, not yet, not the darkest parts. He told her that he had been a drover, that he had worked the Marsh Ranch for the better part of a year until 3 weeks ago, when he had witnessed something he was never meant to see. He told her that a rancher named Josiah Pratt, a small landholder whose property bordered the eastern edge of Sela's marshes spread, had been found dead in his own barn, and that everyone in the territory now believed Cornelius Yates had done the killing, when in truth he had watched from the tree line as 2 of Marsh's own hired men held the old rancher down, while a third put a pistol to his head. He told her that he had run, because a drifter's word meant nothing against Sela's Marsh's money and Sela's Marsh's men, and that a posse organized by Marsh himself had been hunting him across 2 counties ever since, not to bring him to justice, but to make certain he never lived long enough to tell anyone what he had seen. Irene listened to all of it without interruption, her hand still moving, tucking the bandage neatly, and when he finished, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Sela's Marsh," she said finally, "wanted to marry me last spring." Cornelius blinked. "He what?" "He wanted my father's land," she said simply. "There has long been talk of silver beneath the canyon behind my house, though no one has ever proven it. My father refused to sell during his lifetime, and Marsh has been trying to acquire it by other means ever since he died. Marriage was simply the most convenient method Marsh could think of to take what he wanted without the trouble of an outright purchase." Her mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "I told him I would rather starve on that land than hand it to a man who saw me as nothing more than a key to a lock. And you're telling me this because, Mister Yates, Irene said, rising from her chair and moving with unerring confidence toward the small stove in the corner of her shop to put on a kettle. It seems we have found ourselves with the same enemy, and I have found, in my experience, that enemies of Sela's marsh are generally worth keeping close. It was not, Cornelius reflected later, the response he had expected from a small, blind dressmaker in a dusty frontier town. But then he was quickly learning that very little about Irene Wallace was what he expected. He stayed in the back room of her shop that first night, hidden behind bolts of fabric and a false wall her father had built years before for storing valuables, a space so cleverly concealed that even Cornelius, running his hands over every inch of it, could barely find the seam. Irene brought him broth and bread, and refused his stumbling thanks with the same brisk practicality she brought to everything else. "I am not doing this out of charity, Mr. Yates," she informed him, setting the bowl into his hands with practiced precision. "I am doing this because a man who has seen Sela's marsh commit murder and lived to tell it is worth more to me than any amount of thread and calico. If your testimony can be carried to the territorial marshal in Cañon Blanco, it may be the only thing that stops that man from taking my land the moment he decides marriage proposals are no longer worth his patience. And if it doesn't work, if nobody believes a wanted drifter's word against a rich man's," her sightless eyes turned toward him, steady and unflinching, "then we will have tried," she said. "I have found that trying, even when the odds are poor, is considerably better than the alternative of doing nothing at all and waiting to see what a man like Sela's marsh decides to do next." Over the following days, as Cornelius healed enough to move without wincing, he found himself lingering in her shop long past any reasonable excuse, watching her work. He had expected, in the vague way a man expects things he has never bothered to examine closely, that a blind seamstress would work slowly, carefully, perhaps with some assistant reading measurements aloud. Instead, he watched Irene Wallace take a bolt of wool, and using only her hands and a series of small knotted cords she kept in her apron pocket for measurement, cut a pattern for a man's coat with a speed and accuracy that left him staring. "How in God's name do you do that?" he asked one afternoon, watching her fingers trace a seam allowance with the same unerring confidence she had shown when guiding a needle through his own torn flesh. "The same way you rope a steer without looking at your own hands, Mr. Yates," she said, not pausing in her work. "Practice and attention, and refusing to believe that a thing cannot be done simply because most people assume it cannot. It's different, is it?" She held the shears steady, cutting a long, clean line through the fabric without a single wasted motion. "You have spent years learning the weight of a rope, the give of a saddle horn, the exact pressure needed to bring down an animal twice your size, all without conscious thought, because your hands learned it so thoroughly that thinking became unnecessary. I have spent years learning the give of fabric, the placement of a seam, the exact tension of a stitch, until my hands no longer need my eyes to tell them what to do. It is the same skill, Mr. Yates, applied to a different trade." He had no answer for that and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not particularly want one. He simply wanted to keep watching her hands move, to keep listening to the low, steady confidence of her voice, to keep discovering, hour by hour, that everything the town whispered about her was not just wrong but a kind of injustice he had not expected to care about so fiercely. It was on the fourth day of his hiding that he first saw the full measure of what she could do beyond a needle and thread. A pair of Marsh's men had ridden into town that afternoon, asking questions at the saloon and the general store about a big drifter with a gunshot wound, offering a reward for information. Irene had heard them through her open shop window, their voices carrying easily across the dusty street, and she had gone very still, her hands pausing over her work for the first time since Cornelius had known her. "They are getting closer," she said quietly. "Marsh will not stop until he is certain you are dead or gone from the territory entirely. He cannot afford a witness." "Then I should go," Cornelius said, already reaching for his coat, the fresh scar along his ribs pulling tight. "I've put you in enough danger already. If they find me here, sit down, Mr. Yates." Her voice cracked like a whip, and he found himself obeying before he had fully decided to. Running blindly into the desert with a half-healed wound and no plan is not bravery. It is stupidity dressed up as chivalry, and I have no patience for it. "So what would you suggest?" She was quiet for a moment, her head tilted slightly as though listening to something beyond the ordinary sounds of the street, the creak of wagon wheels, the distant bark of a dog. "There is a marshal in Cañon Blanco, 2 days' ride from here. A man named Thomas Whitfield who has no love for Sela's Marsh and owes my father an old debt from before I was born. If we can reach him, if you can give sworn testimony, it may be enough to force an investigation, especially if we can also produce evidence that Marsh's men have been searching for you so aggressively. Innocent men do not usually inspire that much effort to silence. 2 days' ride, through open country, with Marsh's riders combing every trail between here and there. That's not a plan, Miss Wallace. That's a death sentence." "Not," Irene said, rising from her chair with quiet resolve, "if we do not take the open trails at all." He frowned. "There's no other way to Cañon Blanco. I've ridden this country. The only route runs through the flats, unless you mean to go through the canyon itself, and no sane man attempts that on horseback. The trails through there are barely fit for a man on foot, let alone," he stopped, understanding dawning slowly and uncomfortably, "let alone a blind woman." Irene finished for him, and there was an edge in her voice now, sharp as the shears she had set down a moment before. "I have walked those canyon trails since I was 12 years old, Mr. Yates. My father mapped every turn, every ledge, every wash and dry falls in that canyon, and taught them to me stone by stone, echo by echo, until I could walk them as surely as you walk down the main street of this town. Marsh's men know the flats. They know the open roads. They do not know the canyon because no one in their right mind rides through it, and that is precisely why it is the safest path we have." Cornelia stared at her, torn between admiration and disbelief. "You want to guide me through a canyon you've never seen, in country where a single wrong step means a broken neck, to outrun armed men who want us both dead." "I want to guide you through a canyon I know better than any man alive, sighted or otherwise," Irene corrected him, "because it is the one advantage we have that Sela's Marsh cannot buy, bribe, or shoot his way past. He has money and men and guns, Mr. Yates. I have something he cannot take from me no matter how hard he tries. I would ask that you trust it." There was a long silence in the little shop, filled only with the ticking of a small clock and the distant, muffled voices of Marsh's riders still asking their questions down the street. Cornelius looked at this woman, so much smaller than him, so much slighter, and thought of every doubtful whisper he had already heard about her in his few days in Redemption Gulch. The town's certainty that she could not possibly manage alone, that she needed protecting, that her blindness made her lesser somehow. He thought of his own doubt, rising unbidden in his chest even now, and felt something like shame color it. "All right," he said slowly. "I'll trust it. God help me, I'll trust it." Irene's mouth curved into the first real smile he had seen from her, small and fierce and entirely satisfied. "Good," she said. "Then we leave at first light before Marsh's men think to search the canyon at all. Pack light, Mr. Yates. We will need to move quickly." That night, unable to sleep, Cornelius sat in the darkened back room of the shop and listened to Irene moving quietly through her small house next door, gathering supplies with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything. He found himself thinking, not for the first time, about the particular kind of courage it took to be doubted by an entire town and to keep standing anyway, to keep working, keep living, keep insisting on your own worth in the face of constant, grinding disbelief. He had known plenty of brave men in his life, men who had charged into cannon fire without flinching, men who had faced down armed outlaws without a tremor in their hands. He had never known courage quite like hers, the quiet, daily, unglamorous kind that did not announce itself with gunfire or bravado but simply persisted, stitch by stitch, step by step, refusing to be diminished. He realized with some surprise, more than a little in awe of her. And beneath that awe, quietly, dangerously, something warmer was beginning to take root, something he had not expected to feel again after the war had taken so much of the softness out of him. They left before dawn the next morning, slipping out the back of the shop while the town still slept, Irene leading her father's old mule loaded with supplies, while Cornelius led his own horse on foot to avoid the sound of hooves on the main street. She moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the same sure confidence she showed in her shop, her cane tapping lightly ahead of her though Cornelius suspected she barely needed it. So intimately did she seem to know the ground beneath her feet. The canyon opened before them like a wound in the earth, red walls rising sheer on either side, the trail beneath their feet narrowing quickly to little more than a game path clinging to the rock. Cornelius felt his stomach tighten as he looked down into the depths below, the kind of drop that promised a swift and certain death to anyone who misjudged a single step. "Stay close behind me," Irene instructed, her voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "Place your feet exactly where I place mine until you learn the rhythm of the trail. There is a loose section of shale 12 paces ahead on the outer edge. We will hug the inner wall there." He did as she said, and found, to his continued astonishment, that every warning she gave proved accurate. Every hazard she named appeared exactly where she said it would. She counted paces under her breath sometimes, murmuring distances and directions like a woman reciting a well-loved poem, and Cornelius began to understand that this canyon was, in truth, mapped inside her mind with a precision no ordinary trail guide could hope to match. Every stone and turn catalogued not by sight but by years of patient, deliberate memory. "Your father taught you all this?" he asked, during a brief rest beneath the shade of an overhanging rock, 3 hours into their journey. "He taught me to listen," Irene said, taking a small sip from her canteen. "The canyon speaks, Mr. Yates, if a person is willing to hear it. The wind sounds different depending on how narrow the passage, how high the walls. Water, even a trickle of it, echoes differently off wet stone than dry. The ground itself tells a story beneath your feet, sand and shale and solid rock, each with its own particular voice. My father spent 20 years learning that language before he taught it to me, and he always said the canyon never lied to those who listened carefully enough. It was men who lied. The canyon simply was." "That's a strange kind of poetry for a trail guide." "My father was a strange kind of man," Irene said, and there was warmth and grief both in her voice. "I miss him every single day." Cornelius found himself reaching out, without entirely deciding to, and resting his hand briefly over hers where it lay on the rock beside her. She did not pull away. "He'd be proud of you," Cornelius said quietly, "for whatever that's worth from a stranger." "It is worth quite a lot, actually," Irene said, and there was something unsteady in her voice for the first time since he had known her. "Most people in Redemption Gulch believe my father's teachings died with him, that I have simply been surviving on stubbornness and luck these past 2 years. It is rare to meet someone willing to believe otherwise." "Well," Cornelius said, watching the way the morning light caught the fine lines of her face, the quiet strength in her jaw, "most people are fools, Miss Wallace. I'm beginning to suspect I might have been one myself, not so long ago." They continued on through the long day, the canyon walls rising and narrowing around them, the trail growing more treacherous with every mile. Twice Irene stopped him with a sharp word just before he set his foot on ground that looked solid but was, she assured him, nothing more than a thin crust over a hidden sinkhole. Once she guided him along a ledge so narrow he had to press his back against the rock and sidestep with his heart hammering in his throat, while she walked the same path with barely a change in her breathing, her hand light and steady against the stone. By late afternoon, they had covered perhaps 8 miles into the canyon's twisting depths, and Cornelius had stopped questioning her judgment entirely, had stopped, in fact, thinking of her blindness as a limitation at all. He found himself watching her with a kind of wonder he had not felt for another human being in longer than he cared to admit, wonder that was quickly, quietly, becoming something else entirely. It was as the sun began to sink toward the western rim of the canyon that Irene stopped abruptly, her head tilting, her whole body going still in a way that immediately put Cornelius on alert. "What is it?" he asked, his hand dropping instinctively to the pistol at his hip. "Riders," she said quietly. "Behind us on the rim trail above. 3, maybe 4. They are moving fast." Cornelius strained his ears and heard nothing at first, only the wind and the distant call of a hawk, but a moment later, faint and far away, he caught the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats and the sharp crack of a rifle being cocked. "They found the shop," he said grimly. "Someone must have talked." "It does not matter now how they found us," Irene said, already moving, her cane tapping quickly against the trail ahead. "It matters only that we reach shelter before they reach us. There is a narrows half a mile ahead, a place where the canyon splits into 3 branches. If we can reach it before they see which path we take, we may lose them entirely." They moved faster now, Cornelius's heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with the drop beside them, and everything to do with the men closing in from behind. He watched Irene navigate the increasingly treacherous trail with unwavering confidence even as the light began to fail, and the wind, which had been merely brisk all afternoon, began to pick up with an ominous, gathering strength. "Miss Wallace," he said carefully, feeling the air pressure shift in a way that raised the hair on his arms, "I don't like the smell of that wind." "No," Irene agreed, and for the first time he heard something like genuine worry enter her voice. "Neither do I. There is a storm coming, Mr. Yates, and not a small one. We need to reach the Narrows and find shelter before it breaks, or Silas Marsh's men will be the least of our concerns." The first drops of rain began to fall as they hurried along the darkening trail, cold and sharp against Cornelius's face, and above them, thunder rolled across the canyon rim with a sound like the earth itself groaning. Behind them, the hoofbeats grew louder, and now Cornelius could hear voices carried on the wind, rough and urgent, unmistakably drawing nearer. "There," Irene said suddenly, pointing with unerring accuracy toward a dark cleft in the canyon wall that Cornelius would have walked straight past without her guidance. "A shelter cave, 20 feet up that slope. My father and I sheltered there during a storm when I was 14 years old. It should still be sound." They scrambled up the slope together, rain now falling in earnest, the wind howling through the narrow canyon with a force that made Cornelius stagger. He caught Irene's arm as her foot slipped on the wet rock, and for a moment they clung together against the storm, her small frame pressed against his chest, and despite the danger, despite the men closing in behind them, despite everything, Cornelius felt something in his chest crack open like a seed splitting to reveal new growth. They reached the cave just as the storm broke in full fury. A wall of rain so thick it turned the canyon floor into a churning brown river within minutes. Cornelius stood at the mouth of the cave, watching the water rise with a growing sense of horror, understanding with sudden, sick clarity that a flash flood was now tearing through the very canyon they had just walked, and that anyone still on that lower trail, pursued or pursuer, was in mortal danger. "They're still coming," he said, straining to see through the driving rain, catching glimpses of torchlight further down the canyon, bobbing and swaying as the riders realized too late what was happening around them. "Marsh's men, they're going to get caught in that flood." "Then we have a choice to make," Irene said quietly, coming to stand beside him at the cave mouth, her sightless eyes turned toward the sound of the rising water. "We can let them drown and be free of their pursuit forever, or we can try to warn them and hope that mercy is not entirely wasted on men who would have killed us both without a second thought." Cornelius was quiet for a long moment, torn between the cold, practical voice in his head that told him to let his enemies face the consequences of their own choices, and something else, something Irene's quiet, unwavering decency had already begun to plant in him. "Damn it," he muttered. "We warned them." Irene's face broke into something that was almost a smile, fierce and proud. "I rather hoped you would say that, Mr. Yates." They shouted together into the storm, their voices barely carrying over the roar of wind and water, but it was enough. The torches below scattered, riders wheeling their horses back toward higher ground, and within minutes, the flood tore through the lower trail with a violence that would have swept away anyone still caught upon it. Cornelius watched the swollen brown water rage below, carrying branches and boulders in its churning grip, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain-soaked wind. But their reprieve was brief. As the storm raged on, a shout rang out from further along the canyon rim, and Cornelius realized with a sinking heart that at least one of Marsh's riders had found higher ground and had spotted the flicker of their own small shelter fire against the darkness. "They've seen us," he said grimly, watching a lone torch begin working its way along a treacherous side trail toward their position. "We need to move. In this storm." "Mr. Yates, the flood will kill us slower than a bullet," Cornelius said, already gathering their meager supplies. "I'm sorry, Irene, I know what I'm asking." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the sound of it, urgent and warm even amid his fear, made her nod without further argument. "Then we go now," she said, "before he brings the others. There is a higher trail above the flood line that connects to the narrows I spoke of earlier. It is narrow, and in this storm it will be treacherous beyond anything we have faced today. But it is our only path forward that does not lead directly into gunfire." And so they went, back out into the howling storm, Irene once again in the lead, her voice cutting through the chaos with the same unwavering authority that had guided them all day. And it was here, on this final desperate scramble along a canyon ledge in the black heart of a flash flood, that Cornelius Yates found himself exactly where the story began. Pressed against a cliff face in the driving rain, trusting his life entirely to a blind woman's memory of stone and wind and water, and understanding, with a clarity that shook him to his core, that he had never in his life met anyone so utterly, magnificently capable. Left, 3 steps, now stop. Irene's voice rang out again, and Cornelius obeyed instantly, feeling the ground drop away just where she had warned. Behind them, the pursuing rider's torch had gone out, swallowed by the storm or the man's own good sense finally overruling Marsh's orders, and for a moment it seemed as though they might actually survive this night. Then lightning split the sky once more, and in its brief, blinding light, Cornelius saw the trail ahead simply vanish, a section of the ledge having crumbled away entirely, leaving a gap of nearly 6 feet between them and the continuing path, with nothing below but the raging flood. "Irene," he said, his voice tight with sudden panic, "the trail's gone." "There's a break ahead, I don't know how wide." "How wide, Cornelius?" Her use of his given name in return steadied him more than he expected. 6 feet, maybe more, I can't be certain in this light." She was quiet for a moment, her head tilted, listening to something in the sound of the wind and water that Cornelius could not begin to interpret. "The gap is 5 feet 3 inches, she said finally, with a calm certainty that left no room for doubt. "I know this section of trail, Mr. Yates. That rock has been unstable since a rockslide when I was 16 years old. My father and I marked it as dangerous and always crossed at a running jump, timed to the 3rd gust of wind, which comes stronger and steadier than the others in this particular stretch of canyon, funneled by the shape of the walls above us." Cornelius stared at her, rain streaming down his face, lightning still flickering at the edges of the storm, and felt something close to disbelief war with something close to worship in his chest. "You want us to jump a 5-foot gap over a flash flood, in the dark, in a storm, timed to a specific gust of wind that you learned when you were 16 years old?" "Yes," Irene said simply. "Do you trust me, Cornelius?" There was no hesitation in him now, none at all. "With my life," he said, and meant it more completely than he had ever meant anything. "Then take my hand, count the gusts with me, and jump exactly when I tell you to." He took her hand. It was small and strong and steady in his, and together they stood at the edge of that impossible gap, the flood roaring below them, the storm howling around them, and counted the gusts of wind as they came, 1, 2, and on the third. With a shout torn from both their throats, they leapt together into the dark. They landed hard on the far side, Cornelius's shoulder slamming into solid rock, Irene stumbling against him, and for one heart-stopping moment he thought they might both tumble backward into the flood. But his arm was already around her, pulling her tight against his chest, and they held there together, soaked and trembling and alive, while the storm raged on around them. "We made it," he said, disbelief and joy tangled together in his voice. "Of course we did," Irene said, though her own voice trembled slightly now, the first crack in her composure he had seen all day. "I told you I know this canyon, Mr. Yates." "Cornelius," he corrected softly, his hand coming up to brush a strand of soaked hair from her face, his fingers lingering longer than necessary against her cheek. "After what we just did together, I think you'd better call me Cornelius." She went very still beneath his touch, her sightless eyes turned up toward his face as though she could somehow see him despite the darkness and the storm and the years of blindness that separated her from ordinary sight. "Cornelius," she said softly, testing the name, and something in the way she said it, warm and uncertain and hopeful all at once, undid something in his chest that had been locked tight since long before the war had ever begun. He kissed her then, there on the narrow ledge above the flood, rain streaming down both their faces, the storm still howling around them, and she kissed him back without hesitation, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, as though she were memorizing the shape of him the same way she had memorized every stone and turn of this canyon. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, both laughing slightly with the giddy relief of having survived, Cornelius rested his forehead against hers and said, quietly, "I have known a lot of brave men in my life, Irene Wallace. I have never known anyone as brave as you." "I am simply a woman who refuses to be told what she cannot do," Irene said, though her voice was soft now, stripped of its usual brisk practicality. "You are the first man who has ever truly believed that about me instead of simply tolerating it." "Then I'm a fool for not believing it sooner," Cornelius said, "and I intend to spend a great deal of time making up for that particular foolishness, if you'll let me." The storm began to ease as the night wore on, the worst of the floodwaters receding as quickly as they had risen, and by the time gray dawn light began to filter into the canyon, Cornelius and Irene had found their way to a wider section of trail where they could finally rest, exhausted and soaked but unharmed, and undeniably, irrevocably changed by everything the night had asked of them. They reached Cañon Blanco 2 days later, having lost Marsh's remaining pursuers somewhere in the storm's aftermath, and found Marshal Thomas Whitfield exactly where Irene had promised he would be, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and eyes that had seen enough of the territory's corruption to recognize the truth when he heard it. Cornelius gave his testimony in full, describing in careful detail the murder he had witnessed, the 2 men who had held Josiah Pratt down while a third pulled the trigger, and the desperate flight that had followed. Irene corroborated what she knew of Marsh's motives, his desire for her father's land, his thinly veiled threats against her own safety, and the marshal listened to it all with a growing frown that spoke of old suspicions finally finding confirmation. "I have suspected Silas Marsh of foul dealings for 3 years now," Whitfield admitted. "But suspicion is not proof, and Marsh has enough money to buy silence in most corners of this territory. Your testimony, Mr. Yates, combined with Miss Wallace's account of his threats, may finally be enough to move against him properly. I will need you both to travel to the territorial court in Santa Fe to repeat this testimony before a judge. But I believe, with what you have given me today, We have grounds for a proper investigation and arrest." It took another 3 weeks for the wheels of territorial justice to turn, weeks during which Cornelius and Irene remained under the marshal's protection in Cañon Blanco, weeks during which their careful, hard-won affection deepened into something neither of them any longer bothered to deny. Cornelius watched Irene navigate an unfamiliar town with the same quiet confidence she had shown throughout their journey, watched her win over the marshal's skeptical wife with a beautifully mended quilt she repaired in an afternoon without a single misplaced stitch, and found himself falling more completely in love with her with every passing day. When Silas Marsh was finally arrested at his own ranch, dragged from his house in chains while his hired men scattered rather than face similar charges, word reached Redemption Gulch within hours, carried by riders eager to spread news of the once untouchable rancher's downfall. The evidence against him proved overwhelming once investigators began digging properly. Financial records showing his desperate need to control the Wallace land before a competing mining interest could investigate its silver deposits first. Witnesses among his own former employees willing to testify once they saw he was truly finished, and the damning testimony of the man he had tried so hard to silence. Marsh was convicted of murder in the spring term of the territorial court and sentenced to hang, a sentence carried out that summer in Santa Fe, bringing a grim but final close to the reign of terror he had held over Redemption Gulch and its surrounding ranches for the better part of a decade. Cornelius Yates, cleared of all charges and hailed, somewhat to his own bemused embarrassment, as something of a hero for his role in exposing Marsh's crimes, returned to Redemption Gulch with Irene at his side. And this time, the town that had once doubted her at every turn watched her walk down the main street with an entirely different expression on their collective faces. The whispers had not entirely disappeared, but they had transformed, from doubt and pity into something closer to awe and respect. Mrs. Hutchins, who had once complained loudly that a blind woman had no business running a dress shop alone, now told anyone who would listen that she had always known Irene Wallace was the most capable young woman in the territory. The sheriff, who had once suggested gently that Irene ought to sell her father's land and move somewhere with proper supervision, now tipped his hat to her with genuine deference whenever their paths crossed. Cornelius took work at the livery stable while the town's opinion of him settled, though it did not take long before his obvious skill with horses and his quiet, steady manner won him a place in the community that many drifters never managed to find. He rented a small room above the saloon at first, though he spent every possible hour at Irene's shop, ostensibly helping with repairs to the building's roof and foundation, though both of them knew perfectly well that his presence there had far less to do with carpentry than with his complete inability to stay away from her for more than a few hours at a stretch. It was on a warm evening in late summer, nearly 4 months after their harrowing flight through the canyon, that Cornelius finally worked up the nerve to say the words that had been building in his chest since the night of the storm. They sat together on the small porch of Irene's house, the canyon stretching out below them, painted gold and red by the setting sun, and Cornelius took her hand in both of his, feeling the familiar strength and steadiness of her fingers against his palm. "Irene," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "I've been thinking about something for a while now, and I reckon it's past time I said it plainly, the way you'd say it, instead of dancing around it the way I've been doing." "That would be a refreshing change," Irene said, though there was warmth beneath the dryness of her tone, and a slight betraying quickness to her breath that told him she suspected what was coming. "I love you," Cornelius said simply. "I loved you before I ever admitted it to myself, somewhere back in that canyon when you told me to jump into the dark, and I found out I trusted you more than I'd ever trusted anyone in my whole life. I love the way you see this whole world clearer than most sighted folks ever manage, and I love that you never once let this town's small thinking convince you that you were anything less than exactly as capable as you've always known yourself to be. I've got no land of my own, no great fortune to offer you, nothing but a strong back and a horse and a heart that's entirely yours already. But I'm asking anyway, because I can't imagine living the rest of my life without you beside me. Irene Wallace, will you marry me?" For a long moment, Irene said nothing at all, and Cornelius felt his heart hammering against his ribs with a fear far sharper than anything the canyon storm had managed to inspire. Then her free hand came up to rest against his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with the same careful, deliberate attention she brought to every stitch she had ever sewn, as though she were committing the shape of his face to a memory that would need no eyes at all to recall it. "I have spent my whole life being told what I could not do," she said softly, "being doubted, being pitied, being treated as though my blindness made me less whole than everyone around me. And then a wounded, stubborn drifter fell through my door bleeding on Mrs. Hutchins's blue silk, and instead of doubting me, he trusted me with his life in the middle of a flash flood, and fell in love with me not despite my blindness, but because of everything it taught me to become. Cornelius Yates, I have never wanted anything so completely in all my life as I want to spend the rest of it beside you. Yes, yes, I will marry you." He kissed her then, slow and certain. The canyon spread out golden and vast below them, and felt, for the first time in years, that he had finally found the place in this hard world where he truly belonged. They were married that autumn in the small church at Redemption Gulch, with the entire town in attendance, the same townsfolk who had once doubted Irene now crowding the pews to witness her joy. Irene wore a wedding dress of her own design and making, every stitch placed with the same extraordinary skill that had first drawn Cornelius to trust her. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted into applause that Irene, laughing, said she could feel as much as hear, a warmth rolling through the room like sunlight after a long storm. They built their life together on the Wallace land, the canyon behind their house no longer a source of danger and pursuit, but simply the beloved, familiar landscape of Irene's childhood, now shared fully with the man she loved. The silver vein that Selah's Marsh had killed and schemed to obtain was indeed discovered within the year, but rather than the curse it had nearly become, Irene and Cornelius used the proceeds to expand the dress shop into a proper establishment employing several seamstresses from town, and to build a horse ranch where Cornelius's skill with animals could finally find its true home, breeding and training horses that became known throughout the territory for their quality. Irene never stopped guiding him through the canyon in the years that followed, teaching him gradually to read the land the way her father had taught her, until Cornelius, too, could navigate those twisting trails with something approaching her own confidence, though he always maintained, with genuine and abiding awe, that he would never match her particular gift for it. They had 3 children together over the following years, a son born first whom they named Amos after Irene's father, followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Rose, and finally, when Irene was 32, a second son they named simply for the canyon that had brought them together, calling him Canyon in honor of the storm-swept trails that had taught them both, in their different ways, that true strength had nothing to do with sight, and everything to do with the courage to trust, to love, and to refuse. Absolutely, to be diminished by the doubts of a world too small to recognize genuine, extraordinary worth. On quiet evenings, sitting together on the porch of the house they had built with their own hands, listening to their children's laughter drifting up from the canyon, where Irene had already begun teaching Amos to read the wind the way her own father had once taught her, Cornelius would often find himself thinking back to that first terrible night in the storm, to the moment he had stood at the edge of an invisible chasm and chosen, against every instinct his eyes had ever trained into him, to trust the guidance of a woman the whole world had once dismissed as helpless. It remained, he told her often, the single best decision of his entire life, and Irene, resting her head against his shoulder as the canyon wind carried the scent of sage and the distant call of a hawk up from the depths below, would simply smile and remind him that she had known, from the very first moment his stumbling weight had crashed through her shop door, that some things a person simply did not need eyes to see clearly at all. Their love had been forged in doubt and darkness, tested by betrayal and flood and the desperate flight through a canyon storm, and it had emerged in the end, as steady and enduring as the red stone walls that had first brought them together, a testament to the truth that true partnership required not perfect sight, but perfect trust, and that the woman everyone had doubted had, in the end, proven herself the truest guide either of them would ever need, through canyon storms and through every quieter, gentler season of the long and happy life that followed.